All right, we're now joined via Zoom by Professor Alex van der Heever from the Wits School of Governance to weigh in on the response to the cholera outbreak in Hamanskaal. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday essentially admitted, that government failed the people of Hamanskaal while he was there. I mean, the death toll was sitting at around 29 just in Hamanskaal. How would you describe government's response to this long-standing water crisis in the area?
Well, admitting to the problem is hard to avoid because this kind of problem, or this crisis, takes a very long time to emerge. So by the time you have cholera, you've really failed to both construct and maintain infrastructure for a very long period of time. Plus, you have no proper water regulation that protects people from what are essentially informal sellers of water who could be selling you anything, contaminated with anything. So right at this stage, government as a whole has failed. And now the question is really whether government can get its act together. So I think that's the position that we're at. And it potentially does look like there has to be an agreement across 3 levels of government to address this particular issue. But it is clearly not localized to Hamanskaal alone. This is actually a more widespread problem. And water infrastructure is failing in many different areas. And we are seeing cholera in areas outside of Tshwane, which really talks to significant failures in infrastructure maintenance throughout South Africa.
What is also worrying, especially for the rest of South Africa, is the fact that they still have not identified, the source of this outbreak. And as you mentioned, it has spread to other areas in the country. What then should be the response be, from a countrywide perspective, seeing that we are now sitting with 32 people that have died?
Well, what's unusual about not being able to identify the source of the problem is that you would normally go through a tracing exercise once you've identified cases of cholera, and you would go back to which water sources people have used recently and begin your investigation there. This is, 200 years ago, this was where epidemiology began. It was with cholera outbreaks in London. And essentially, when they looked at where the people were falling sick, they chopped the handles off the water pumps and off the relevant water pump, and it immediately stopped the outbreak. We haven't yet identified which water pumps are causing the problem. So this, to me, is interesting. It's very odd. And I would say in the public domain, we're not getting enough feedback from NICD and other environments on other organizations as to where the source of this particular problem comes from. But it's not only cholera. The water is contaminated with other kinds of bacteria, etc., and there's a generalized problem. So people are not only getting sick with cholera, and we are also, from what I've heard from experts on the side, is that there is is that we're probably not we're not seeing all the deaths. Not all the deaths are being reported as cholera deaths. And we can't be sure that, in fact, we've even got the scale of the infections correctly identified at this point. So those are also quite worrying issues. But I think that also the people who've been profiting from the failure of the infrastructure are sometimes also people who are involved in destroying infrastructure in order to keep providing water to communities informally and for money. And that is also potentially a source of the cholera, depending on where that water was obtained. So there's a lot of worrying issues to manage here.
And that is very interesting, Prof, because that's exactly the sentiment from residents that, the water system itself, the entire infrastructure or the entire value chain is susceptible to that, having people take opportunistic moments in a crisis to identify monetary means. But another thing that this has, I think, identified, Prof, in terms of, just some of the glaring problems between government and the people of South Africa is the trust deficit. I mean, interestingly, yesterday, the president reminded residents of the social contract that government has with the people of this country through the constitution of providing clean drinking water. So to what extent can this further erode the trust between government and its people?
I think it can erode it, and you know that reliance on both public services and public utilities of this kind involve a great deal of trust, because you're drinking water on the assumption that somebody has actually ensured that it is safe to drink, and when you drink it and get sick, it means that contract has been broken. So the issue now is, what is government going to do to actually rebuild that trust? It's got to do a lot. Now, the problem is that it's got to do that when a crisis has emerged over a long period of time. And the problem is, correcting a situation like this can't be done overnight. It's a problem that has accumulated over 15 to 20 years, and you're not going to solve it in 1 year. You can mitigate it, but you can't solve it completely because of how long it's taken to get to this point. We're also seeing that we don't only have one crisis that's happening at one point. I mean, it's interesting that we're seeing multiple crises, both from energy to water, that's water availability, as well as sanitation, all impacting simultaneously at extreme levels. It's worrying, but it's showing that there's been a very, very significant failure of government in providing core functions. And I think we also have to be very wary of the fact that with every part of our public system that has failed, some private profiteer is gaining. And this creates incentives to degrade our infrastructure even further, to attack it. So whether it's electricity distribution, water, etc., and public transport, all of these can be attacked. So somebody on the side can force you to go to their particular service. So I think that we have to be wary of what's going on. But quite aside from that, the failure of infrastructure spend to actually hit the ground is also worrying. It's not that we haven't been spending the money. It's just that it basically 2/3 of it appears to be disappearing. And the amount that is spent doesn't end up changing the infrastructure on the ground. So this is a problem because we've also used up resources. We've used up financial resources that actually haven't translated into infrastructure. And now we're having to allocate more funds, scarce resources, to deal with a problem that we essentially paid for over the last 15 years, but clearly has just drifted into the ether.
And on that point, Prof, I mean, the question of governance and how these monies will be handled becomes more important, because essentially the president promising that there are multiple kind of solutions that have been brought to the fore in terms of what's happening in Hamanskaal, saying that in 6 months' time, they've commissioned the Magalies Water to build a slightly smaller water treatment plant, and that should take roughly about 6 months. I would imagine that is probably a short-term kind of solution. But what is of concern is you are already starting to see the blame game between national government and local government. To what extent do you think that these renewed promises to the people of Hamanskaal will actually happen?
Well, I think it depends very much on how the procurement for the infrastructure is now managed, because there are serious concerns with infrastructure problems across the country, where the procurement process, first of all, it's slowed down because kickbacks are being negotiated. And then when the projects actually begin, nobody's really under any pressure to finalize them. So just making sure that the money that's allocated actually goes where it should do, and that most of the money isn't stolen, can result in the services being infrastructure being upgraded. But I think a lot depends on who's going to be responsible for these projects, how transparent is the procurement going to be, and how are the projects going to be managed in such a way that the public can be assured that they're going to complete in 6 months, and that we don't end up with a Madupi, etc. type, which is a dramatic indication of the kind of project that we've seen across South Africa, money being blown left, right, and center massively on infrastructure and nothing ever resulting. So I think a lot now depends on the public putting a lot of scrutiny on what these promises are and making sure they come to fruition properly. And both the local and provincial and national government have to be looked at very closely, because there's so much money to be made in these construction projects, and it's the reason why they deliver nothing.
Prof, thank you so much for your time and your analysis this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. Professor Alex van der Heever from the Wits School of Governance, just weighing in on the cholera outbreak in Hamanskaal.